Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast episode 6. I'm here with Ken. How are you doing, Ken? As you drink your water there.
All the best. All the best.
All right. So I thought that the last stream was very interesting. I thought it was a good conversation. And we are still looking for more guests. So if anyone wants to come on and discuss some issues that we've discussed or that they care about, we're definitely open to scheduling that. I have been in contact with a few other people, but for today, Ken always has a lot to talk about. So Ken sends me a list of topics, and I'm at liberty to choose some interesting ones. And if you haven't checked out Ken's channel, the link should be in the description. So, what is hereditarian democracy?
Well, hereditarian democracy is this kind of synthetic political theory I've been thinking about. You do have the traditional monarchy, the aristocracy. Basically, you have a class of people who have political power by virtue of their ancestors. And then you have democracy, which is just everyone has, one man, one vote. You then vote for representatives where really there is no hereditarian component whatsoever to that political system. Now, of course, you get the dynasties like the Kennedys, the Clintons, even Trump, could politically or potentially have a political dynasty. So that hereditarian component doesn't become eliminated. It just becomes secretive and it becomes dirty and it becomes hidden. And therefore, I think it's less accountable. I mean, when you do have these the fact that, if you are born into the 1%, chances are you stay in the 1%. And so we already do have a hereditarian political system. The problem is that it is pretending to be a democracy, and therefore it's not held accountable for its actions.
Now, this sounds similar to arguments coming from neo-reaction for many years, which that system is called formalism, and that's basically the argument that if you're going to end up being controlled by an oligarchy, you might as well make that explicit so you understand what the relationship is.
Right, yeah, and then you can criticize it, because the point of criticism is not to be vulgar, it's not to be deconstructivist. The functional purpose of criticism in a healthy society is that you're actually interacting with the institution. So if I have the First Amendment and I can say, screw Donald Trump, I hate the president, people think that means we have the power to criticize our masters. But the truth is, if you don't know who your master is, then you can't criticize them. So actually knowing who's in power and establishing that and formalizing it, it does seem to be an important component of having a more meritocratic system, or a system that's held to account. So the NRXers are right on that. But I think when they go to the opposite extreme and they some of them, the neo-reactionaries, talk about, let's just go back to a pre-Enlightenment monarchic European system. And my problem is that that system fell, and it fell for certain reasons because it couldn't adapt to new challenges that it was facing. And so is there a kind of Hegelian synthesis that we can have here where we say, okay, concentrating all the power in the top 1% of a hereditary clan is not able to be held to account, right? If you look at Kaiser Wilhelm II, he had a shrunken arm. Now, the traditional function of the aristocracy is to fight wars. If you got a shrunken arm, you can't fight in wars. All kinds of genetic dysfunctions in the aristocracy because they weren't actually being tested in battle. So that became defunct. It degenerated as a natural consequence of removing that aristocratic principle of death out of the aristocracy. It sort of fell out of its mold. And we know the flaws with democracy, but if we could reintroduce a hereditarian component to democracy, then that would help alleviate some of the problems of democracy while not buying fully into the problems and the flaws with a monarchy, for example. So this could be instituted in a number of ways, and it can be instituted to different degrees. And that's kind of why I like to experiment with these ideas when they're in a degree, because people will say, are you going to have 100% democracy or 100% monarchy? And then you can attack that and say, well, it's contextual. It depends on the society, the culture, the region we're talking about. What degree of hereditarianism do we inject? And so basically, the idea of a hereditarian democracy is you say that the right to vote is something you inherit from your ancestors. It's not just you become a citizen, you get the right to vote. You become 18, you get the right to vote. There's a hereditarian component to it. And of course, I think you did a video on the Star Troopers and the eugenics and everything, people having to serve in the military to be able to vote. There's nothing wrong with the concept of voting. In the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor was elected, but he wasn't elected by everyone. He was elected by a certain number of people. The Pope is elected by the cardinals. He's not elected by all Catholics, but he's elected by certain Catholics. So the idea of voting, actually, in National Socialist political theory, all the top National Socialists, including Hitler, believed in some kind of codified system of voting after the period of necessary dictatorship was over and the political arena had stabilized. Then you would have some kind of elector system with, say, 100 senators, and they would elect the chancellor or whatever. So, so you can have some degree. Now, is it 100 people? Is it 1,000,000 people? Again, that's a question on the time and the place. But having a hereditarian democracy, I think if we had something like instated in the original Constitution that, if you're a descendant of an American citizen at this time, then you inherit the right to vote, then we would have a totally different political landscape today rather than what we've had over our history.
Mm-hmm. Conservatives like Buckleyite, 1960s through 1990s conservatives have advocated restrictions on voting, and the effect of that would be to make the voting pool more representative of the traditional hereditary stock of this country. But I'm curious how that would actually pan out in its implementation. Effectively, this would close off entry of, because the reason why the U.S. is still competitive is that we are taking the best and brightest from India and from China and from all over the world. Like mass immigration is not helping us, but the brain drain effect, the benefit that we get from that is allowing us to maintain competitiveness in fields where we don't have the cheap labor, we don't have all of these advantages, lax regulations that emerging economies have. So how do you respond to that defect of a hereditarian model where it doesn't incentivize the best and brightest to want to join your society?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the question of why is America still succeeding, and how does immigration interface with economics? Because we know, I think everyone can agree that there's a certain class of people who benefits from immigration, from taking people in, whether we're talking about manual labor or we're talking about the H-1B visas. I think definitely the 1% are benefiting economically. The question is, what is the economy in relation to the nation? What is the economy in relation to the state? And is the state vis-a-vis the economy, is that actually improving? Is the nation actually improving? Those are different questions. So I would question the long-term effects of if you bring in people based on short-term incentives of like, okay, we have a labor shortage, we need people right now for the next 10 years in this market. Well, they're bringing people in, and we look at automation, they're bringing people in who their jobs are going to be defunct. We won't need their labor in 10 years because of automation. But they're bringing them in because they don't care about the long-term consequences.
Right.
They just want
I'm
the
not really
short-term
talking
gains.
the typical H-1B visa type. Like if the Anglo-American establishment in the 1800s didn't accept German immigration, if we didn't in the early 1900s start accepting Russian immigration, this country wouldn't have had Tesla. We wouldn't have had, von Braun, we wouldn't have had Einstein over here. We wouldn't have had these people who set up a technological supremacy centered on this continent, and the technological infrastructure developed on this continent and nowhere else, or not somewhere else first. So that
Right.
kind of
I mean, well,
advantage.
that's it's an interesting proposition. And I guess on this one again, I'm gonna look at the facts. And I mean, we can look at the project to build nuclear weapons, and we all know that those were Jewish immigrants from Germany who headed that project. We know about von Braun, right? We know about the space program and everything. But then again, I step back and I look at the bigger context of the long term, right? So we started the nuclear program, and after we started it, well, Russia stole it, China stole it, even now North Korea has it. Everyone's got it. So someone created that technology, a team created it, and then it was stolen. And we don't have the nuclear monopoly like we did in 1945. If we look at the space program, we made great advances. Now the space program is basically defunct. We don't do it anymore. So when I look at the long term, I say, yeah, there are instances where you have these teams of geniuses that you can kind of steal from other countries. I mean, literally, you have to look at it in the context of that war. It was entire classes of people, switching sides in that war and coming over here and then literally kidnapping people, bringing them over here and for a very specific purpose. Now, in the short term, in the context of the Cold War, wow, that was so important that we had the nukes first and that we built up our space program. But then you look at where we are today, and it's almost irrelevant. It's almost like, well, so what? If the Russians had developed it first, we would have stolen it, and now NASA is defunct, so who cares anyway? So in that moment, everyone can see how that was very important. But now from the big context of we're talking about civilizational systems and long-term politics, then it's like, oh, well, it doesn't matter that much. What I see as the big driver of American success over the centuries is that you have a basic stock of people who are, it's kind of a middle class civilization. You have people who are, workers and tradesmen and builders, and they're architects, and they're at this like middle management level is really the strength of America. And it has farmed the land and it has industrialized the land. And, bringing in immigrants was seen as very advantageous and did make a lot of people rich throughout the history of America, not just in the 20th century, but in the 19th and the 18th century as well. So it's very important for those people. But my question is, okay, from the long term, in terms of political stability, cultural strength, things where you're not only able to have a big and powerful nation, but how well can you direct it toward a single purpose? Because if you have a nation of hundreds of millions of people, but they're all divided amongst themselves, yes, you have a large GDP taken in the whole, but you can't direct them toward any one thing. Whereas you have a smaller nation, less resources, but it has a unity of will, a unity of culture, and therefore it is more competitive in a deeper sense than, okay, let's just add up and subtract all the economic factors in a theoretical sense. So that's kind of the problem I see. If we never had that German immigration, if we never had any immigration at all past, the 1820, let's say, if that was the case, I think you still would have seen explosive population growth from the founding stock, and they would have filled out America, and there would be less Germans and Italians. We would have less cultural diversity, essentially. We would probably have a smaller population, but it wouldn't be that much smaller because of the way that fertility has worked throughout the centuries, increasing and decreasing fertility. And then, at the end of the day, we might have lost a Tesla, but ultimately that technology would have been brought to America. And I think we would be in not exactly the same place, but we'd be in a similar place, and we would not have a traditional concept of the hyphenated America. We wouldn't have the concept of the melting pot. We wouldn't have had all these concepts that have been taken and run to the nth degree and taken and made into a hyperbole of themselves to this point where I think it was Emma Lazarus, her poem on the Statue of Liberty says something like, "Give me your poor, you're tired and you're hungry." And it's like that ethos, which is like this snowballing of an originally sensible idea of immigration, then snowballing it into, now we're a dumping ground, or now it's just all about, a Blade Runner society where everything is disgusting and ugly. But hey, GDP is increasing, so that's all that matters. So, that's
Right.
kind of my big picture take on it.
Yeah, I think there are several extremes here that result in the death of the organism.
Hmm.
So cells aren't closed systems. Bodies aren't closed
Hmm.
systems. They're open systems. And the way that we assimilate new matter has to be strictly regulated. On the flip side, they're not completely open. So I think that's the kind of danger that you're talking about. But why did Rome start awarding Roman citizenship? This was an
Hmm.
extension of a process that began in Ukraine 3300 BC, a gradual unfolding of enfranchisement, political sovereignty, down the ranks of society. Now, this is not meant to be like all castes blended into one. What this is offering a role in governance to the, it's a meritocratic system where someone coming from below is able to be brought into the
Hmm.
system. So anyway, this is what Rome does. And did I lose you, Ken? Yeah, we lost Ken. So, are you there now? Anyway.
Yeah. Keep going.
Okay, good. So, now, if Rome did take it too far and they assimilated certain groups, and we know some of who those groups were, into Roman citizenship and into the imperial court, right? The court historians, the advisors, things like this, and those people retained the identity that they had before. So the kind of model that I'm thinking of in terms of hereditarian democracy is not like an Athenian model where all ethnic Athenians, so to speak, inherit their birthright of political representation, and this is a somewhat closed system. What I'm thinking of more is any Tesla or any Einstein who comes around who wants to join the society has an interest in doing so because they can enter, maybe not under full political rights, but enter the society and then work their way into this hereditary core. I think that is kind of the way
Hmm.
that Rome worked at a certain point, and it seemed effective.
Well, that's Judaism in some senses, is that you have a core Judaism, and then they say, "Hey, this guy, he's really smart, he's really powerful. Let's get a nice Jewish girl to go marry him, and then his kids can be Jewish, and then we'll get those genes." And so it is a powerful model. It is a model that is proven to work, and anyone who wanted to copy that model would eventually, if they stuck to it with enough rigor, they would be successful with it, and they would form some kind of parallel society to Judaism, and they could kind of take it in their own direction or whatever. So, and I think people are doing this. I think the Mormons are doing this. I mean, Mormonism is not a closed system, it's a semi permeable identity where most of the people are white, but they're trying to bring in non-white people. So the Mormon of the future is not going to be 100% white or whatever, but they're going to kind of be mostly white, and they're going to have certain off-white features and whatever. And they have a eugenic system set up where if you look at the highest IQ Mormons, they're having the most kids, and actually the lower IQ Mormons are having less kids. So I think Mormons are already doing this kind of a thing. And anyone else who wanted to start doing that kind of a thing, I mean, it's like starting a business, right? You need a lot of initial capital. It's very difficult to do because there are other businesses out there who are setting up these costs, trying to keep down anyone who tries to, copy the business model, and they have different mechanisms of doing that. But theoretically, it's possible, right? But again, it's the degree to which, and within Judaism, you have disagreements about how open do we be. There are certain sects of Judaism which have said, we're not accepting any new converts. No one new. So anyone who's already in, you're already in. So if you're an Orthodox Jew, generally, I think they're called the Karaites or whatever. It's hard to memorize them all. But they're like, if you're an Orthodox Jew and you want to become a Karaite, go ahead. But if you are Reform or even lower degree than that, then sorry, we're closed. And so within Judaism, there are actually parallel systems of how to do this. Whereas the Reform might say, like, hey, if you're Chinese and you want to be a rabbi, that's fine. Most Jews are somewhere in between where they say, okay, yeah, we can all be Jews and we can kind of marry with other groups, but the rabbis, the Kohanim, if you're a rabbi, you should be descended from a rabbi, and that's a pretty strict thing that cuts across multiple sects there. So this is something that could work, and actually, it kind of goes into my next topic, which is the idea of a rabbinical university. I don't know if you wanted to go into that one.
Yeah, just maybe finish up on this real quick with what I'm seeing here. So you're agreeing that this is a viable model. Is that what you originally had in mind in terms of hereditarian democracy?
Well, again, it depends on what are the merits that your society defines to make you eligible for political rights. So historically, the European aristocracy said, hey, if you go out and battle and you basically win a Purple Heart or an Iron Cross, the medieval equivalent, you go out there and you prove yourself in battle, even if you were not a noble, you could become a noble. So someone who had commoner blood, they would actually gain a noble status and their citizens would then be nobles. So this didn't happen every day, but it basically was the process by which the aristocracy got new blood. When there was a lot of warfare going on and the aristocracy was fighting actively in the battles, this sort of thing was happening all the time, where the aristocratic sons with the shriveled arms would get basically bred out of the aristocracy, and the guys who were commoners, who are really good in warfare, would be brought into the aristocracy. Now, Judaism, for the last 2,000 years, has pretty much had a complete moratorium on all physical violence. And so what they've done is they've had a selection process based totally on, verbal IQ, your ability to gain money, your ability to dissect the Torah or something like that. So two different systems, same meta principle, but very different directions and very different end states.
Right. I'll just read some of the comments from Mr. Coolmug. He's said that he thinks that a one man, one vote of the serving population, so the people in the military or the men in the military, would be best from a practical standpoint. Well, many Roman emperors were effectively elected in this manner, not unanimously across the whole military, but their legions, the men of the legions, would effectively elect the emperor. And that's really more in the event of a chaotic social setting. I think that's when that does make sense. Just my opinion. Then the terrible implication is that this is relating to when I was talking about we need to take the best of the best. Because now, first, to qualify that statement, I think that there's a geopolitical aspect of that, there is a eugenic aspect of that, and then there's a moral aspect of that, which is, if you're just valuing heredity for heredity's sake, blood for blood's sake, you're kind of missing the point of what should be at the core of the civilization. This is why I don't really value existence as a central principle, because then, you want to continue existing because you value existence. It's purely circular. You want to have some kind of higher value. Now, that could be something aesthetic. It could be something having to do with the nature of our bodies, but still, that doesn't preclude other people entering into this phenotypic set. So that's a transformation into the type, whether it's an ideological type that we have. Like it used to be the case in the United States, we had a certain set of principles. If you abided by these principles, you could join the society and be American. But anyway, so there's that moral aspect. There's a eugenic aspect, clearly in that, mutations, there are 7 billion people on the planet, and they happen rarely, but sometimes they're effective. And it's much faster to progress in terms of, towards whatever your ideal is, whether you're valuing abstract intelligence, verbal intelligence, whatever the case may be, it's a lot faster to simply assimilate the groups that originally obtained those mutations. And then the geopolitical role of this that's important is that if you don't take those people, if those people don't have any interest in joining your civilization, or if they think that the presence of your civilization is a threat to them because they are by definition excluded, then they'll be very likely to join your enemies. And you want to deprive your enemies of that human capital. And it's the top 0.001% of people that make any difference at all in terms of what happens in war. Those are the people who run the finances. So those are the people who develop technologies, the people who govern the army, the logistics specialists, like that small group of people, by and large, determine the outcome of war. The people who can break the codes. So you don't want to exclude those people, in my opinion. So, and it's not that we don't have geniuses of our own. It's that we don't want the enemy to have geniuses if we can have them instead. And the way you do that is to set yourself up at the ideal level, aesthetic level, as something that people want to join. That's what the United States did. And it was effective. We were a light on a hill, shining beacon of liberty and hope. And however much of that was a false dream, it did effectively recruit a lot of quality people. I am one of the people who do believe that there was some kind of selection effect in the European migration to the North American continent, where for a time at least, we were on average at least healthier and a bit more intelligent in certain respects. And then I agree, but we should take people who are close in terms of blood, capable and willing. Immigration should be selective. Yes, which is why I think that you need layers, circles, radiating outward from the central sphere of the civilization that's defined tightly, right? This is the core group. This is also the way that Plato describes Atlantis in the Cratylus. So there's the center island where the stock was founded, and then there's rings emanating from that, at the very most fringe of which is the merchant area, right? And then there are ways to get more and more into the society, but it requires generations. And these, going back away from Atlantis into a more abstract political sense, you got to think about it like Hellenic civilization, or like the Aryan expansions. Like, these weren't states. They weren't states with one immigration policy. We need to get away from state-based thinking, because whatever comes next, I don't think it's going to be the way we think of nation states today. And this is what Kurt Doolittle advocates as well, having a multitude of smaller political entities that are united by some sort of guiding civilizational ethos or bloodline or whatever it may be. But if you have some groups in this broader Hellenic, metaphorically, culture, then some can have more open membranes and some can have more closed membranes. And, so you have your Spartas that preserve the Doric stock, and then you have your Athenses, where you do have philosophers coming in from other regions, and there are benefits to both approaches. And Greece, the Hellenes as a whole, benefited from that diversity. Now, there is clearly some sort of error that they run into because Greece was conquered. Now, it may just be an inevitability, but you want to look to this kind of Atlantean design of identifying a core and then identifying the territories where assimilation is progressively made possible. I like this topic of hereditarian democracy, and I'm going to keep on reading the comments because there's a little bit more. If I was given 100K cash, what would you do to advance your goals? Well, I might do something foolish. I don't know. I would probably buy land and start a school. I want to start a school. That's always been a goal of mine. I think that they own the academy, And if you want to compete, you have to have some sort of alternative academic system. And I've brainstormed about the nature that system should have. Yeah. All right. So if you wanted to comment again on hereditarian democracy, which I think that's probably going to be the title of this. I didn't leave one yet. Or we could move on to the next, whatever you want, Ken.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was kind of going to go into the idea of, and maybe this connects with what you're saying about a school is the rabbinical model of the university. That traditionally the European model of the university comes out of the monastic system, where you have some kind of community with a farm, buildings, industry. You've got grape farming, winemaking, whatever, sheep, and or you're producing like books to sell. It's like this self-sufficient utopian community that people are trying to do now, except without the Christian element. And that physical geographical space has very strict laws about codes of conduct and living with one another. You're separated from the rest of society. You're celibate. You're not interacting with women. And in that, you then have discussions, dialogues, writing. You're reading Greek philosophy. You're then coming up with things like scholasticism. That you're then talking, letter writing with other monasteries. That's kind of the European style of a university system. And it still exists today, right? We still have physical universities. The rabbinical style of the university is very, very different from that. The rabbinical, well, first of all, Judaism as a whole doesn't have a pope, doesn't have these centralized hierarchical authorities in the same way. And so you could just get a rabbi who's kind of off on his own, writing off on his own, and he has some ideas and he just starts publishing them and writing them, and other rabbis start reading them, and they might agree, they might disagree, and they do this thing called pilpul, which is just this argumentation back and forth, trying to deconstruct arguments, trying to promote arguments. And so the Jewish idea of a university, or how knowledge is shared and processed by the community, is much more decentralized, and it's much more kind of like, you put something out there, if we like it, then you're considered an honorable rabbi, and then you gain some status, and then we start taking what you say seriously. Or if you put stuff out there and no one likes it, then no one cares, and you never get heard of. And it is kind of the way that the internet is set up today, as this non-hierarchical thing where anonymous posters can just put out stuff without any intermediary of publishing, or there's no customs to it. There's no initial startup cost. You just put it out there. If people like it, they spread it like a meme. And if they don't like it, then it dies and no one cares. So when we talk about schools and universities, this is the kind of system that I see being successful with the kind of current technology we have, is moving away from the traditional European model of, you have the schoolhouse, you have the community. And I think that really appeals to Europeans on a deep level. And I think that's part of the reason we still have it, is because maybe on some genetic level, like we need this sort of thing. We just instinctively desire it. But the internet does mirror a lot more of the traditional Jewish idea of how a community creates ideas, how it criticizes those ideas, and how it moves forward intellectually for solving various, metaphysical, spiritual, religious problems. So when we think of like a political movement like the alt-right, there was a lot of demand, and in fact, there were a lot of, I don't want to say secret societies, but there was a thing called the alt-right corporation. And so all the popular people in the alt-right became board of directors on the alt-right corporation. And you talk to some of these people today and they say, well, it just didn't work out. It didn't work because fundamentally, if you don't hold state political power, if you don't have a religious monopoly, as the Catholic Church used to have in Europe, then that sort of thing doesn't work. Given what you have, which is you don't have state power, you don't have a military force, then it makes sense to mirror again the Jewish strategy of, you have a decentralized model But I'm just saying, I would say it's a minoritarian
we're
strategy. But for
we're 2 for 2
Europeans,
now
it's too.
on what we're saying at the end of the day on both of these topics is let's just copy the Jews, all right? And I don't think that's
Yeah,
a bad
but
idea by and large. So,
yeah, but here's what I would say to that. Like, obviously, you, instead of naming this hereditarian democracy, you could just say this, like, when in Jewland, do as the Jews do. Like, you could say that, or what you could really say it, and how I like to describe it in a more scientific way is this is a minoritarian strategy. The Jews were stripped of their military power. They were stripped of their centralized political power. It was not an option for them. If they tried to form a military, if they tried to form an independent Jewish state, they would be slaughtered. So, this is the situation they found themselves in. And they said, how do we survive? And what they converged on evolutionarily was a thing I call the minoritarian strategy. Is this is something that every minority basically aspires for in order to survive. You see it with the Zoroastrians, the Middle Eastern Christians, the Amish, whoever else. Whenever you have a minority, they're always converging on this strategy. And the Jews have been very successful with it. The Zoroastrians, not so successful. But you get different groups with different degrees of success. And what I'm saying is we have to pursue a minoritarian strategy. And to most people who grow up in a European society, they look at European history, they see two groups: the majority Europeans and the minority Jews. And so when I say minoritarian and I describe what that is, I have to, go to the example of the Jews because that's what people can connect with. That's what people see as real and relevant to them and Western civilization. But really, we are just talking about game theory here. We are just talking about cultural wars and political wars and how you win that and how you survive.
mhm.
And like, you can either accept that and pursue that strategy, or you can say, oh no, that's what the Jews did. We don't like that. We're going to keep pretending that we have political power. We're going to keep pretending that we are, military aristocrats like our ancestors and keep pursuing a majoritarian strategy, which is why you have people who want to start political parties. They want to go out in the streets and fight people. They want to do all these things that make sense if you hold power. But if you don't hold power, it's a minoritarian strategy you have to pursue. And that, unfortunately, is associated in people's minds with Judaism. But again, you don't have to embrace the idea of Yiddishkeit. You don't have to embrace the idea of being like an effeminate, weak cosmopolitan or anything like that. You can have a different ideal, but these are the kind of systems like a hereditarian democracy, a decentralized university, and we could go on and describe more things. But
Right.
you're always going to run into this problem again and again and again.
hmm So there are a few things that I want to cover, and I'll just start with the two comments that are responding to what you're saying. So, Mr. Kulmag, this parallels the idea of a WASP diaspora, which has been developing and which he is against. He thinks it's a weak position, that it's a surrender of a relevant identity attached to country or nation or soil, effectively. And I think there definitely is something to that, although you can still be a distributed, you know, minoritarian group that has a locus or nexus centered around a historical homeland, and a mission can be to reclaim that homeland. So, like, you don't have to give up the idea of the sacred land. I think that's actually part of every good mythology. Now, space-time DCR, without a coherent religious identity, the alt-right can't be like Jews. And I think this is probably correct, which is why I've always advocated that we do need to sort out things like metaphysics and ontology. Because now I do think that some sort of decentralized educational system is called for, but we can't let it be purely decentralized in terms of orthodoxy building. Because if you don't agree on metaphysics, you can't really agree on cosmology, you can't really agree on ethics. In order to have shared goals, you have to have, at a certain level, a shared model of the world. And the internet is not conducive to that as a whole. It's conducive to that in terms of allowing very specialized niches to emerge. And that has happened and is happening because of the structure of the internet within the alt-right itself. So without that religious orthodoxy, without some sort of, you know, codified metaphysic, I agree with space-time. We can't do the Jew thing. Um, and Mr. Coolmug, yeah, it will just be deracinated, atomized people with some attachment by blood, but ultimately useless. Yeah, we need a replacement for the actual soil. We need some kind of ideal homeland. And that is part of the mythos that has developed in the alt-right. I think some of the most exciting times in recent memory, that is in the last like 6 months, were, you know, on the Warski stream when they were talking about the ethno-state every week. People got excited about that because they felt like they were talking about a shared nation, a shared home, and imagining that being a place on the map and even talking about where it might be, that gets people invested far more than, you know, I'm a distributed cog in this decentralized ethnic diaspora. Like that, people don't really get riled up for that. Now, relating to the university and what you were talking about, the advantages of the rabbinic model versus the monastic model, I think there are advantages to both. And I'm going to also talk about what you said about the minority religious groups in the Middle East. And part of what they did was to have a pilgrimage to a certain holy site. They would congregate for festivals and actually meet in some physical location. Now, we kind of tried to do that in a sense, but it was directed outward. The alt-right did, that is, with things like Charlottesville, and that was wrong-headed. I think we do need festival times, and we do need to come together. And, you know, some people do that. TRS, pool parties, and things of this nature attempt to fulfill that. But this is, you know, what I have in mind for if I'm ever able to start a physical academy, and that is to have it be somewhere where people can, like, really, you could do this very simply. You know, buy 15 acres out in the middle of nowhere in Maine or something, and agree that 1 week in the summer, just 1 week in the summer, everybody's going to try to go there and camp out and exchange knowledge. And it doesn't have to be just that 1 week. You could have, you know, different classes. You don't need a physical building even. Like, this could be done very cheaply. This is just me talking in terms of like, what can I actually do on the ground in the vein of, you know, forwarding these ideas. I'm not the most realistic thinker. I recognize that when it comes to this. Probably some sort of internet-based system that centralizes the ideological contents better and has some form of self-censorship, like a website, something like this. I've talked about things like that, but I'm not a systems engineer in the online space. But I think some sort of mecca, some sort of place to just go out in the woods and, you know, get together and exchange information and bond. And like, I don't see why this shouldn't already effectively be happening. Why? Because you're going to have people infiltrating. Like, you don't have to talk about really seditious stuff to bring about the positive result that this Mecca pilgrimage like site could have. It could be very innocuous, like going out and exchanging pragmatic information, just having discussions, and maybe a few classes on certain subjects. That breeds consensus and also trains skills. I think the monastic environment and also the modern university environment, it doesn't just formulate theological ideas like the rabbinic pilpul or whatever it's called. It also trains an etiquette and an academic way of life that goes beyond just what's written on the page. And the danger of remaining in an exclusively electronic space when it comes to this is that you never develop those mannerisms. And, you know, I see alt-right people sometimes, they're often awkward, and a little more socializing in the real world wouldn't hurt most of us, I think. I'm going to read the last comments that came up, and then let me know what you think. So, Mr. Coolmug, Palingenesia A. The process by which you come to truly value your bloodline is essentially a religious one. Yes, I mean, early mythology is often effectively ancestor worship. Even Greek mythology is ancestor worship because they believe they're descended from Zeus. Ultimately, they're descended from these heroes and gods. So that element has to be present in some form. Mr. Coolmug, you're psychically preparing for another loss. I think crisis is the only way this is going to end up, and we have to win. Michael Bosner, but you're completely right-headed in your thinking. I don't know where he's probably a little bit behind in what's actually live right now. Psychically preparing for another loss, that just brings up one other thought that after you comment on what's been said recently, I do want to kind of talk about prioritization of values. Like, if we're going to have collective identity, if we're going to engage in collective action, how do you set that priority of goals? To me, something like like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How do you draw that for a political group?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, what are your thoughts, Ken?
Yeah, I wanted to do a video on Maslow and kind of create a new hierarchy. I mean, the fact that you have people fasting, which is they're giving up food for something else, then that something else is probably more important than food. But anyway, to the point of people meeting up, just buying 15 acres of land, going out there, meeting up. I mean, it was done, and I should really do some edits of old documentaries. If you had in the 90s, I mean, people think of Charlottesville, and you'll have these headers like, it's the biggest right-wing rally or white nationalist rally in 10 or 20 years. And so my instant thought was, well, what was the last biggest one? They won't even talk about it. And so it's almost been erased from the popular consciousness of even what happened 20 years ago. So the attention span is so fast, people aren't able to learn from the recent history, let alone history of what happened 70 or 100 years ago. So, in the 90s, you did have exactly what you're talking about. The problem, I would say, with that is that it was structured as a mass movement centered around skinhead culture. And so you did have a lot of these people, and it was a big thing, and you did have thousands of people going out in Southern California, and just, open space, 15 acres of land, and it was like they had the Rock Against Communism, and it was just a big music festival of these white power music groups or whatever. And ultimately, the police were there, and they were trying to shut it down and say, you're violating a noise ordinance. So there's all kind of legal, I mean, we have such a legal bureaucracy that it potentially, it doesn't really affect people's lives because it's not activated. But the second the state perceives a threat, it activates it. William Pierce National Alliance, they had 15 acres of land in Virginia. I don't even know what's happened to it. I've talked to some people. I've said, what happened to it? They say, oh, we don't know. Maybe it was sold off to someone or this or that or the other thing. But it's been mismanaged. I mean, a lot of money had to go into purchasing that land, and it's just been wasted, right? So people have not been effective at organizing the resources that they have, let alone gaining new resources. And so my mind is like, we should be focusing on the internet, having a kind of decentralized university system of people who are competent, who can manage resources, and then taking those people, once you've sort of assembled a loose confederation, then you say, okay, let's all meet up in a place, and it's not going to be for the purpose of street fighting. It's not going to be a mass movement, but it's going to be something Freemasonic in nature. It's going to be something like, I guess the Northwest Forum has something like this, or I mean, there have been different alt-right conferences, and the problem, of course, with the conference is you go to like the Ronald Reagan building, you pay like $100,000 to rent it out for one weekend, and what do you have to show for it? It gets shut down, and Antifa comes and they're protesting, and there's so many problems with that. It's like, why can't everyone just go meet in a barn somewhere? Which is actually what they ended up having to do. Richard Spencer ended up doing that for his last conference. But I think there has to become some kind of taking the best elements of all these failed ideas, combining them, getting rid of the detritus, and saying, yeah, let's have, first of all, an elite orientation, because we're not ready to have a mass movement. Second of all, once we have that group of people established, let's meet together. Third of all, We're not going to spend a bunch of money on it, making it a fancy cocktail party, or making it basically a money making scheme. It can be simple. It can be meeting in a field or something. It can be anything. But then what you're saying and what the commenters are saying, it has to ultimately be of a religious character. People have to be united in their ideals. And so people want to say, oh, we want to accept atheists, we want to accept pagans, we want to accept Christians, because we just need a lot of people. Now, if you're talking about electoral politics, the election of Donald Trump, sure. Yeah, get everyone on board. The bigger the better, the more people, the more merrier. But when you're talking about actually constructing a goal-oriented collective that works with one mind, one vision, and one purpose, then you do have to have some kind of religious context. Now, traditionally in America, everyone was a Christian. So when you had a political group, it wasn't really a problem because, hey, we're all Christians. Freemasons were like, okay, we're Judeo-Christians. But there was always that backdrop. Today, that has really fallen to the wayside, and it's created a whole host of problems, and it's going to have to be solved in some way or another. Just ignoring it has not been a solution. So I agree with the commenters.
Now, just because things have failed in the past or have not worked out doesn't mean that these things are insurmountable. Again, going for a synthesis, I think that online distributed educational system that you're talking about can be integrated with the religious desideratum, can be integrated with 15 acres of land somewhere. And the way that I see that being structured, I've given a lot of thought to this, but my latest thoughts are essentially, and I've aired some of these in some capacity, but a website that is strictly vetted. I mean, you can never do it with 100% accuracy, but that is effectively a hierarchy, right? Where nodes, so the way that, what's his name, Adam Weishaupt set up his system was that one person is connected to two people, two subordinates beneath them is connected to two beneath, and so it's a pyramid structure, basically, like a Ponzi scheme kind of setup. Now that is close to what you need, but it's insufficient. You also need nodes providing redundant communications between all connection points. And this is structured where, like, in addition to having a contact with your direct supervisor, you also have contact with maybe varying people of a commensurate rank on that same level, or maybe going above, 2 ranks up once in a while. But just the point is, like, these systems have been designed. We know how to structure effective hierarchies, that you don't need any common institutional basis except for the hierarchy itself and the constant communications between nodes. And so these can be done, like, the hierarchy can be established and laid down in, like, whatever system you're using to track rank, can be organized on the website. But all you have to do is have, like, communication with your direct supervisor once a week. And if everybody around the system does that, then needs coming from the bottom are communicated up. Like, if somebody from below me tells me something, I can communicate that up the chain and resources can be redirected. The real question is really just building a system that works. There's plenty of research out there. That's the kind of thing I would be interested in designing. I just don't know if I'd be competent to put a website together. But once you have something like that, then like, okay, who is widely acknowledged as having competence and being trustworthy, and we take those people and we send them to that 15 acres, like you're saying. So basically, we need the website, we need the decentralized education system, communications network, and we need the field. I forget if I said that already. Anyway, so there's some more comments that I want to read. And yeah, people are interested in this question of how do you move forward. What Gedge is asking, how do you move from an intellectual movement to collective action? That's exactly what Ken was talking about, and that similar movements have failed. These intellectual movements have failed. And I think basically the reason is that we are too fractious. We don't accept authority. Now, when it comes to reaching ideological consensus, like you can't do that because first of all, like not all minds, even if they're very intelligent in other respects, not all minds can comprehend all levels of abstraction. Like I'm not the smartest person in terms of IQ. I don't have a great memory. Like there are definitely faults in my intellect, but I am capable of a very high level of abstraction, which means that most people, even if they have a high IQ, can't even evaluate whether I'm on the right track or not when it comes to metaphysics and stuff. So how do you attain orthodoxy unless people just say, okay, like you're the priest, we're going to trust you? We don't have that. So this kind of hierarchical mechanism is definitely necessary, could be built into a website, and the communications media could be you know, redundant and distributed, and we can use different communications networks as long as the hierarchy is remembered. And even the information about rank can be multiply sourced. So if someone shuts down a website, it doesn't have to shut down the hierarchy. There's good evidence that the Nazi hierarchy under Operation Paperclip, the Nazis who came over actually did maintain their chain of command. So this can be done. Mr. Coolmug, I don't have any answers. I think we must just prepare for things to wrap up. Conversations and intellectual movements help define how things should be, but it's a matter of waiting, in his opinion, for now. I disagree. I think if you wait, you die. And if you want to wait, then, like, if that's your mentality, then I think what you should do is find people who also want to wait and literally just go out, buy 100 acres, and build bunkers and breed and get a food supply. And like, if you want to wait, at least wait where you're not going to be slaughtered. You know, most places in America are not safe in the event of some kind of social collapse. So if you want to wait, do it reasonably. But I don't think that's the course of action to take. So we need opportunities fundamentally. This is also Mr. Coolmug. If we're going to make any sort of moves, which we're not prepared for anyway, but the opportunities are getting scarcer and scarcer, especially in Europe. No, you can create opportunities, especially if you can infiltrate other institutions and organizations. Like if we don't have that hierarchy, like basically think the Illuminati, think the way that Adam Weishaupt set up his system. These people were communicating to each other with letters. He didn't need a website. He was able to do it and infiltrate all the Masonic lodges, all of the secret societies, the Rosicrucians, all this stuff, and put forward his political agenda. And he made things happen. His organization made the French Revolution happen in all likelihood. They made the revolutions of 1848 happen. So no, we don't need to wait for opportunities. We need to organize hierarchically. That's the only thing we really need to do, in my opinion. And even doing it inefficiently, even doing it imperfectly is better by far than not doing it at all. Bifurcated duplicatus, but you know, Mr. Coolmug, I think like it's a perfectly reasonable like prima facie position to have, that we're just waiting for the right opportunity. Most people are not high agency. And the people who are extremely high agency are the ones who create opportunities. History doesn't just happen for anybody. Like, history is created by somebody, in my opinion. Bifurcated duplicatus. How about just being white? Why is this so hard? Come on. There's over 4,000 different sects of Christianity, and they all disagree with each other. Yeah, they don't disagree with each other on everything, which, you know, religious differences aren't a proof that the religious framework is not effectual. So there are differences within Judaism, but Judaism's highly effectual. There are differences within Islam. Like, everything branches. That's evolution. The point in designing your system is to account for the fact of the branching and capitalize on it, which is what like Kurt Doolittle talks about with "Let 1,000 nations bloom," and have them united at some level. But you don't need perfect unanimity. And probably that would make your system more fragile. Mr. Coolmug, you're just white now. What's it doing for you? I don't know what he's talking about. Oh, he's talking to the other guy. All right. If you have any comments, I'm going to look through and see if there's anything else I want to read out here. Ken.
Okay, yeah, I don't know. It's a very distract. It's like anarchy in this comment. We need to have some hierarchy in our comment sections. We need like appointed moderators, guys. If you're commenting to someone in the comments, use that person's name so we can follow what's going on. Yeah, this is totally leftist garbage that's going on here. Shame on all of you. But yeah, it's there's I don't know. There's a lot of different ideas. I've gotten lost in all of it. But I don't know. Yeah, waiting in a bunker, probably not a good idea. Doing stuff, probably a good idea. I don't know. Okay. So here's something I'd like to touch on. TRS forums. There was something going on with that. They had it was not a codified hierarchical system, but you had something going on where you could have anonymous users promoted to moderator positions. You had vetted groups that interacted with it. Now what they're trying to do is they're like, okay, we're going to totally shut down this forum and we're going to make it only open to vetted people. We're migrating everything over to a new system. Who knows what's going to happen to that? Hopefully they implement some kind of strictly hierarchical system where it's like, okay, here are the vetted groups for Chicago, for Los Angeles, for Boston, whatever. And we're going to take all of that and we are then going to give it an online platform, which is parallel to the real life platform. So people can communicate, people can share ideas, people have an idea space, and then they meet up to actually discuss what's going on. Because part of the problem is that traditionally, when people say, hey, let's meet up in the real world, that turns into, let's go fight communists or let's drink a lot. And I don't think either of those are very productive ideas. So what I think people should be focused on is let's have like an online discussion, and then once a week, like a book club, let's get together and talk about it. I mean, Andrew Anglin has called his little group thing the book club. I don't know if they're actually doing that. I don't hear anything. He doesn't really have any public information about that anymore. So I don't know what's going on with it. But I definitely think that different people, at least one person who I can think of, who is, what is his name? Jesse, forget the guy's name, Sven from TRS. He's trying to implement something like what we're talking about. But then you look at the implementation and he's like, I don't know how to do this. Someone else do this for me. I don't know. There are web developers, there are web designers, there are people who maintain websites. And it just seems like their abilities aren't being harnessed well enough. They're not being directed toward these projects. And when I look at a project like that, I think there are a lot of people who are like, yeah, I want to get involved. I want to do the work that needs to be done. Just let me do the work. And those people, the communication there is not happening between the people who have the power of the audience, right? You cast a wide net. You say, hey, all you white nationalists out there, you want to come talk about this? Then from that, you get like a 10% of a 10% filtering down process. You create hierarchies, and then you actually have planning. You say, we're going to work on this project this week. Okay, you guys over there, you specialize in the web design. We're going to talk about, ontology and metaphysics and whatever. And you divide all that up very neatly into categories and subcategories. It obviously can be done. It was happening. And for some reason, they're like, okay, we need to, this platform that we have, which is the TRS forums, we're going to totally shut it down and migrate to something new. The question is, are they going to be successful in the something new, or is it just going to fall apart? I mean, it's like the fourth iteration of their forum. They've shut it down and brought it back and shut it down and brought it back. But, something like that needs to be done. And I think, I don't know, maybe Stormfront was an initial kind of trying to do that back in the 90s, but it's never really got going to the point where and it does come down to a lack of agency of people who are just like, hey, I just want to get online and chit chat and have fun. And that's my problem. I see a lot of people who want to talk, and it's like, yeah, talking is fun, but it needs to be structured. it needs to be purposeful. You can't just get on, oh, what's the alt-right drama this week? Oh, what personalities can we talk about? And that's what the blood sports devolved into, is it was more of a focus on the personalities than the ideas. And at some point, that ceases to be productive. There's an initial attractiveness to it. It creates interest. And so it might bring new people in. But after a time that burns out, you can't just do that forever. So I don't know. There have been attempts to do this. I think the train is still, I still have hope that people independent of you and I are going to implement these kinds of ideas. But at the end of the day, it's questionable. But these ideas, we're trying to put them out there, so please steal them so that you can do them. If we're not implementing them, then implement them yourself.
Yeah. And if anyone wants to, because specifically what needs to be designed is a chain of command, is a hierarchy that ultimately leads to one agent, whether that be an individual or whether that be a cabal of 5 or 6 or whatever it is. That chain of command needs to be instituted. And if you want to come on and discuss the nature of that chain of command, I think everything else can follow very naturally from it. And there are, features that we can capitalize on to give us, like, because how do you start the chain of command? Usually these things start when one charismatic person comes along and makes themselves a leader. And then they appoint, representatives, they appoint commanders and generals and everything. But we have like differences in innate ability that we can actually measure with a high degree of accuracy, so we can use IQ tests. And when it comes to like, are you a representative of the group in question, we have genetic tests. Like, there's so much testing that we can do to pre-position people and sort people, and then institute tests and systems of scoring that can be done on a weekly iterative basis to move people up and down the totem pole, so to speak. And maybe some purely elective aspect for a figurehead is appropriate, I think, because the point of a figurehead, the only thing you can really measure as to whether they're effective is if they engage the mass of the people. So they don't have to be the decision maker, but like some democratic element for that, for the Führer, so to speak, is necessary, in my opinion. There's a ton of comments all of a sudden, so I'm going to just read through these. Thoughts on jazz from Spacetime DCR. Jazz is degenerate for the most part, but some of it is a natural progression from the late 18th or 19th century improvisatory tradition. So like, people know that Mozart and Beethoven in Vienna would have engaged in improvisational contests. And I think there's a Beethoven documentary that you can find on YouTube that has the person portraying Beethoven in this kind of like piano duel. That stuff was also going on in ragtime, and if you watch the movie The Legend of 1900, there's a piano duel in that, ragtime piano duel between the fictional main character, and then I forget who he is, but he's actually a historical ragtime / early jazz musician. So, what I'm most surprised by, and this is kind of controversial for the alt-right, but I understand that African thought is not just inferior. There's something unique about it, and it does have advantages, because the jazz pioneering work, a lot of it was done by blacks, and there's no way around it. Like, if you're one of these people who really believes like blacks are inferior, they did stuff harmonically, and they have a harmonic intuition, jazz musicians, that is very, very impressive, and they're doing something right in that. But it also reflects their general disposition and will, which is lascivious and a high time preference, and not the kind of thing that's going to lead to higher civilization as a rule. So that's why jazz is kind of degenerate. But it does include a lot of innovations that aren't just like giving up tonality, like Berg or Webern or someone. Bifurcated duplicatus. How do you eliminate the universalist aspects of Christianity that sees all people as children of God? Well, I think perennialism just addresses this. If you can see the perennialist message in Christianity, then you can naturally come to the conclusion that perennialists typically believe that races do share some kind of common spirit. The totem in primitive societies is something like an embodiment of the racial consciousness, and individual development is predicated on membership in that, and disconnection from the racial root is basically forestalling any further spiritual development. And there are some things in Christianity that white identitarians have used historically, like that it says in the Bible that the nations are going to be around until the end times. And nation comes from natio, which is common birth. So there is some stuff to be used, but yeah, if you're a biblical literalist, there's enough there that you can also ignore that and practice race mixing and culture mixing. So you do need some new form. And somebody said, yeah, Stewie Griffin said, I think Christianity needs to be raised. I'm a pantheistic Christian. We probably, you and I, Stewie, have some similar views. Mr. Coolmug, in what ways are they divided? Okay, he keeps on talking to the in the chat from now on. Yeah, and somebody's doing it. Bifurcated Duplicatus is doing it. Use the at and then who you're talking to. That way I won't read it. Okay. And palingenesia. How about racial consciousness plus perennialism as an explicit overarching elite religious structure? Allows for a polyvalent approach and greatly reduces the possibility of religious disputes. Yeah. No, that is possible. We talked before about like having some sort of broader identity as the movement, and then individual societies within that, distributed networks, and diversity within that, so that you can take advantage of different challenges as they come up, be less likely to go extinct. But perennialism is kind of a tailor-made to do exactly that. And going back to the Illuminati and the Rosicrucians, that's what they were doing. They took perennialist themes via Hermeticism and then used those themes in all of the exoteric religious structures that were extant. And I mean, it's certainly possible to use that same strategy again, but with a somewhat more salubrious version of perennialism than the Hermetic alchemy stuff came up with. But I also kind of believe, just heart of heart, I have a moral intuition that it ought to be out there for all to see. Not that you should reveal all doctrines to the profane. I think an initiatory tradition is necessary, but I do believe a new formal organization, church organization, is something to think about, is something to come up with that is initiatory, because that way also, I mean, once this system exists that maybe has a perennialist basis, then you can go out and fund opening a church and have someone trained as clergy to go out and, ostensibly when you walk into the church, it's just some Protestant sect or something like that. But as you get into the church and as you become initiated into the teachings, then you get into the perennialist aspect, as well as the nature of the racial consciousness and things like that. Which, these things we're brainstorming here, but I like that a lot of the people in the chat are, thinking along these lines of concrete action. So I wish that I had. Can you read the comments too, Ken? Do you have it on your phone or what?
Yeah, I can read them on my phone.
Would you mind?
All right, I'll pull it up here. It's in my app, and then I have to find where you let off and where I can pick up. I don't know who Rupert Sheldrake and his morphogenic fields. I don't know about that.
Morphogenetic fields. Um,
Yeah, morphogenetic fields.
this has something. Well, actually, I can't find where that. What's the content? Can you just read the whole comment
It
where it
just
appears?
says it just says sounds a bit like Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that comment. It's strange. Um,
It's the
yeah,
latest
I
one.
see. Um, so morphogenetic fields, yeah, basically that. And I'm not an expert on this by any means, but that there's non-local variables, space-time harmonics, effectively that result in shared collective kind of common racial experience. And this has to do with like the hundredth monkey experiments, which I researched when I was in college, and it seemed like they were probably not hard science, but subsequent research has revealed that there may be some sort of reality to this. Um, but basically, like, we do understand that there's a holographic principle to space-time, and we encode information at a local level genetically, and we distribute that information across space as a species, and so effectively set up like a harmonic uh, topology in the environment, and changes in that network could theoretically have an impact on the whole system. So this would completely change the way we look at evolution. Effectively, it wouldn't be evolution localized to a particular material change in one genetic code in one place. It would be more like a common shift in methods of experience is affected because of a critical mass reached in one place. Um, but yeah, I've mentioned before Tiller. I forget his first name, but he has research along these lines, and he does work with like random number generators. And probably a lot of people have seen this, like when 9/11 happened, the random number generators that is distributed across the planet spiked like in non-random sequences. And when like Princess Diana died and things like this, we do see spikes in this sort of activity,
Mm.
which I think that needs to be borne in mind strategically. Part of the reason why a religious identity is so important is that coming to consensus and being along in the same lines consciously uh, acts as an intention amplifier. And all of this has materialistic corollaries, so you don't have to believe in the far out kind of non local conscious phenomena stuff. But it's suffice to say that if we can operate on a similar wavelength, then all of our action will resonate with each other and combine in its effectiveness. And if we're divided, then it won't have this effect. We'll be kind of dampening the signal of one another. So I think we missed some comments though before that, huh? It looked
Yeah,
like
I just read the latest one because I don't even like so many comment chains of comment chains. This duplicatus is saying if we introduce a new sect, then we're probably going to fail to bring everyone under one tent. And then the Mr. Cool Mug response is the tent is bigger than Christian divisions, which are physical. This is highlights your utter ignorance. Okay. What I would kind of respond to duplicatus is saying that I don't know, the idea of bringing like the entire white race under one tent, or let's bring all like this ecumenicalism of Christianity, let's bring all the sects under one tent. It's not going to happen, but that's not my intention or my goal. And I don't think anyone who's reasonable has that intention or goal. Maybe it's a romantic thing. It kind of appeals to us on as a narrative, like a Genghis Khan bringing all the tribes together so that we can go out and conquer. it seems like an appealing thing. And of course, the pan-Europeanists like Julius Evola was talking with Count Kalergi about pan-Europeanism, and they thought that Mussolini and fascism was going to be the basis for a new pan-Europeanism. So, I mean, Napoleon had an idea of pan-Europeanism. It's like an old idea, and it's something that appeals to people, but it's not really one that I advocate. I think it's far better to have a dedicated, concentrated minority of people who know what they're doing, they're directed, and then they view all these other disassociated groups who have no common interest, but they manage to influence these groups in such a way as to harness their power, their decentralized, disassociated power, and you funnel that towards certain concentrated purposes and goals to achieve results. And this is how politics works in America. And so, like, we talk about the baby boomers. I'm not looking to like say, oh, let's convert all the baby boomers to my ideology. I'm saying let's meet them where they are. Let's use them where they can be useful because they do have a lot of resources and they do actually have a lot of knowledge and they are correct about certain things, or they're at least pushing in the right direction. Let's harness them where we can harness them, but not to say like, oh, let's bring them into the fold. I don't have this idea that we're going to start the White People's Party or the white Protestant sect of Christianity or something like that. And then we're going to get, 200 million people to join into that official hierarchy. And then we're going to form this nation and we're going to like be this traditional state. No, we're going to be a minority. We're going to try to recruit the best and the brightest, like a kind of an Operation Paperclip, like a kind of the project to build the nuclear bomb. You recruit a bunch of very intelligent people, and then you try to, from that nexus, from that locus, you try to then influence other peripheral groups that are not, they're never going to assimilate into your group. You're never going to have the same identity. There's always going to be differences between different Christian sects or different European ethnicities or whatever. It's not like we're all just going to be white and Christian and all just get along, but you have to create some core that then is able to radiate outwards and have an effect on the rest of larger society. That's how I see politics working generally.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's some other comments you wanted to read, or I should just go on to something else.
There are a couple that I do see. Mr. Coolmug, if we need hierarchies, we need them in physical movements. I don't think we're in a climate that is good for physical movements. Intellectual movements work for now. But hierarchies exist in successful intellectual movements. Otherwise, it's not a movement, it's just an intellectual space. Like the forum, or sorry, the agora in Athens was not a philosophical movement. Like everybody could talk there, and that's effectively what the internet is. Now, the Platonic Academy was a movement, and it had a hierarchy. The Lyceum was open, but even when it existed, there was, of course, some sort of hierarchical structure. The Stoics, and even all of the Sophists, they had disciples and people who were authorized to teach the system. And complete intellectual anarchy, it results in people propagating messages that are actually toxic, that hurt your reputation publicly, and which corrupt the minds of the people who you're trying to help. So you do need some sort of hierarchy, even in a strictly intellectual movement. Now, the temptation is, naturally, to let that hierarchy emerge as a result of satisfaction of market demands. In which case, okay, J.F. Gariepy is now the leader of the intellectual movement because he has the most viewers a lot of the time. But that's not effective because people gravitate towards people they can understand. You don't get the most intelligent people at the top of the viewer list or whatever. I don't know what I'm trying to say. You don't get the most viewers with the most intelligent people because those messages don't transmit as effectually. I mean, look at the way, if you've ever seen a true genius, like, okay, Kurt Doolittle is very intelligent. Look at the way he talks. Not to like say anything bad about him. I think for his neurotype, he communicates very well. And but there are other people who just brilliant minds who don't have the charisma to run a successful YouTube channel or even to have the style of running a successful blog. Market demands are not sufficient to establish hierarchies for an intellectual movement because you don't get the best rising to the top. You get the best rhetoricians rising to the top. And that's exactly what happened in ancient Athens. And that's exactly what Socrates and Plato attempted to redress. So hierarchy is necessary. That's the long and short of it. Michael Bosner, do you not think informal internal self-selection would be best? Informal self-selection, I just don't think that's a coherent model. I don't think it happens. I'm not sure what it would even look like. Like vague, that's non-operational language to, again, borrow from Kurt's mentality. You need to operationalize your prescription for a movement, for a social system. You need to know how it's actually going to appear in practice, how it's going to be organized. Having faith in it just kind of coming together is not the mentality of a high agency person. That's the mentality of a low agency person, which means it doesn't mean that you're useless if you have low agency. It just means that you are most effective if you can export or outsource is the word I'm looking for. Outsource your executive function to someone who's specialized in that. There are a lot of people who are high IQ but low agency. Those are people who are like working in laboratories and stuff. They're not going to lead anything because they might not even care particularly about what direction politics moves in. But under the right leadership, they can change the world, right? So Mr. Coolmug is they're talking to each other. Yeah, they're still talking to each other. Bifurcated. So sect, now you already addressed this. All right. This is a little messy. Did you have anything that you wanted to address, Ken?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Be nice if there was a forum system and you submit your comments sort of in advance and then well, that's more my style anyway. You prepare for it, you ruminate over it, and then you discuss it. They kind of on the fly. I mean, look, if you're sending in super chat donations, then we can start going down the random and the highly chaotic paths. But I don't know how effective it is for purposeful discussion. I see a lot of this stuff and I'm just like, we've already covered this, or
which people pop in and out. This. Like not everybody's seen the whole thing, so it's really not a way of doing things on a permanent basis. And we won't be able to do this forever. If we keep doing this, if we get better at this, presumably more people will watch in the future, and we won't always be able to do this. But for the time being, now I think it's nice to at least try.
Yeah, I mean, just the thing about it's like this whole conversation is summed up by Duplicatus saying Europeans are finicky and opinionated. We have many different beliefs and moral teachings. The problem remains. So, I mean, yeah, that's true. People are more interested in, and there's a kind of strength to it. The fact that people want to argue things out and be confrontational. That's how you do come to a consensus. That's a certain way of reaching a consensus, right? Is to just argue it out. But it does take a long time. Sometimes it takes years of people making arguments until they reach a consensus. But I don't know. There are people who I think are ready to move beyond some of this stuff. Like people send up unrealistic goals for themselves, and then they realize the Sisyphean task that they've set up. Like, let's get everyone on the alt-right to agree. And that's what they tried to do at Charlottesville. They're like, let's find something where everyone can agree. We can all come and defend this statue. And so they set up a false premise of our goal should be to unite everyone, because once we unite, it'll be this magical moment where we have this huge number of people, and that will hit some kind of, will activate some kind of like crisis button or trigger point or butterfly effect, and it'll be like an earthquake, and everything will just resolve itself from there. That's not really how it works. So the idea that we even need to get people to agree with us is on some level false. Like what we need is to take the right people and get them to agree with us. Like it's not if you can get everyone to agree with you. It's if you can get high IQ, high abstraction, high agency people. If you get all those people, then you win. But if you get 99% of people, but you neglect the 1% of best people, the 1% is going to beat the 99% every time. And this is kind of what people don't realize when you talk about like, oh, the populist versus the elitist, or the nationalist versus the globalist, as if this is some kind of contest. It's not. It would be like saying like, well, how many children do you need to beat up an adult? It's like, okay, you could have 1 million babies, but they're never going to be able to beat up a fully grown adult, under normal circumstances, because they're not even on that level to even recognize like what is fighting, or to even conceptualize it. So that's what people are talking about when they say like, we just have to get everyone, like the masses of the people, to like follow some kind of routine about like the white genocide, the Bugs mantra, like racism is a code word for anti-white. All those attempts, cast a wide net and get those memes out in the public space. That is one function that needs to be done, but that is not the end all and be all. You can't just keep plugging away and doing that, because ultimately about 10% of the United States population is receptive to that. You do polls, and about 10% of Americans will say things like, if you're a Nazi, whatever, that's your opinion. So about 10% of people are receptive to political extremism in the rightward direction. And that's the limit. You're not really going to push that to be more or less. It's just going to be what it is. What you do is you select from that 10% the people who are the best and the brightest, and you get them working on creative problem solving. Like this is a group thing that happens together. It's not just the guy sitting in his basement like solving math problems. This is why university systems exist, because problems are best solved in teams of researchers. You have to get people together talking about this. So yes, there are people who are going to keep coming up with these perennial problems of, oh my God, we can't reverse the Enlightenment, or oh my God, we can't get everyone to follow one Christian sect, or wait, but there's Celts and there's Germans, but there's also Slavs. Like, how do we unite everybody? People are going to keep going on repeat with these questions, and I had many of these questions myself, and it's just a maturation process of, can you get out of that mire of focusing on the exoteric, on the like, why can't we get everyone to vote Republican or something, to the esoteric of, okay, what are the actual mechanisms of political power, and how do we deal with the understructure, the substructure of society, that's where real power is held, rather than just focusing on the expression of power.
Right.
So I could keep going on like that for a while, but
so
I'll
on
leave
the
it there.
on the same comment, what I would say is that all you have to do is persuade, and I mean I'm saying the same thing that Ken was saying, but all you have to do is persuade the top 1% of the cognitive elite of a group, and you persuade the group. Because the top 10% listens to the top 1%, the top 30 listens to the 10, and so forth, until everybody listens to the top one way or another. But because of the way that these systems are arranged, where all of the information of these movements aren't consolidated, and that consolidation needs to take place by enforcing a dialectic between the cognitive elite. And a hierarchical mechanism is a way of doing that. So on that point, what gauge, if I understand correctly, step one is to get 100 approximately dedicated 140 and up IQ people on the same page to make a white nationalist Illuminati. How do you do that? So I'm not a white nationalist, just so everyone is very, I don't believe in nationalism. I think a whole other paradigm is necessary. I think Ken's also kind of on that page, fifth political theory more so. Um, so anyway, yeah, I mean, IQ tests, getting the smartest people, forcing a conversation. I mean, how to do it specifically, I think we just have to think what, as if you were coming up with a marketing campaign. If you have a product to sell, how do you distribute it to the public? How do you advertise it? Well, first you have to have the product, and for me, that product is structured around incentives. So, you can sell the idea of, hey, join this hierarchy, the stipulation being to be part of it, you have to maintain contact with your supervisor and with your inferiors, right? So that you're calling somebody on the phone or on Skype or whatever once a week, and the information is flowing so that that top 1% effectively does consolidate the rest. But, what makes someone want to do that? Why do you want to do that? Sell them on the benefits of it. Some being like, okay, well, if you have problems in your personal life, it would behoove you to have access to the executive function of people with higher IQ. Like if you're going to make a business decision, or if you're going to decide, like, should I buy a house in this area? Do you think the market value is going to go up? If you have a network of people of varying levels of cognitive, ability to draw upon, then that's a very tangible resource for you. But I think more explicitly, to get the top 1%, what I've seen on YouTube where people are getting super chats everywhere, people are trying to get money on Patreon. I don't know if that even exists anymore, but people are trying to monetize. The top people are, and that's where they're going. They're going on the platforms that are able to be monetized, and they're doing the kinds of content that allow for monetization. So basically, the alt-right elite has turned into cam whores by and large. That's the way it seems to me. Now, you do need to satisfy that need for monetization. So one way of doing this would be to have this hierarchical structure arranged as a subscription system so that everybody pays in, say, $5 a month, and we simply redistribute most of that to the people spending the most time. So like if you have somebody with a very high IQ with a lot of knowledge of history and politics, you want them working full time. So you want to invest your resources in them and allow them to do work for you. And so like some sort of monetization aspect where you're able to fund researchers effectively is something to do. This is one of the ideas that I've had for how to build a better academy model. Well, allowing anybody to come in and pay a very low amount of money and move up the hierarchy. Once you're at the top of the hierarchy in your field, then you get paid, right? And you're a professor. But just being an open system as opposed to the relatively closed system of the modern academies where you're a professional because you were hired by the institution, instead of just being like anybody in this system has the ability to start earning as long as they move up through this meritocratic academic hierarchy. The mechanisms are all just nuts and bolts, how to put it together. There are different systems that we could draw from. I mean, like the FIDE ranking system in chess has some mechanics that might be useful. Again, institutional structure. There are like Italian noble families that had like the way that the Doge's palace worked and the advisors in Venice, and like there's all sorts of secret societies and things throughout history that we know how these hierarchies worked and why they worked, and there are people who are experts on that. First step though is really just getting smart people together to talk about this. And hey, why not? I like integrating ideas. Why not start discussing it here as we're currently doing? This is step one. If you can contribute to this conversation, come on. And that's what I started with. Come on, and we can discuss your ideas and prove that you're wrong, or maybe be persuaded by you. And that process doesn't go on enough because the people with the big streams are afraid of letting people on because they might be awkward and scare away normies. And they need the normies to donate super chats. And that's just unfortunately the reality. Um, so, yeah, there's bifurcated duplicatus. Explain fifth political theory for us, please. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Ken already described it earlier, but in a nutshell, it is simply that we are a diaspora people and we need to politically organize on a voluntary basis as a diaspora group. We need to build the kinds of infrastructure and institutions that are tailored to that. We need to adopt a minoritarian strategy. And I think that probably there's an extension of that. You can use this at a pragmatic level and say that given our circumstance, this is the way to go. But I think I might actually want to carry it forward into this is the model of government that I think is simply better, where there are corporations effectively offering government services where you subscribe to the service and it gives you benefits. That's kind of what I was describing with the hierarchy model. So you subscribe to the service and you get benefits by participation in the hierarchy. And neo-reaction has talked about this. Anarcho-capitalists like David Freeman have talked about this. So it's all very firmly in the firmament or the melting pot of ideas out of which the alt-right in the first place emerged. But I don't know. Do you think you would characterize it any differently, Ken?
Fifth political theory, just, yeah, you put it pretty well. The blog that originally coined the phrase has been taken down, unfortunately. So I don't use it anymore. I use the term minoritarian strategy. And I hope that's a term that gets picked up more and more because, I obviously it's a pretty simple derivation. You're a minority, you're a minoritarian. It's a strategy. It's not that inventive. But I think it's something that should enter the lexicon. And I think that's also an important aspect of getting together and talking with people is you actually sort out at the most basic populist level, it's the memes. What kind of language, what kind of slang can you develop to form a lexicon, to form a vocabulary that signals your status within the in-group, that signals that you're someone who's well integrated and well assimilated and has a social capital within that group. That's the populist level. And then you build it up to what Kurt Doolittle's doing, where it's like, okay, we need a rigorous scientific language with which to describe reality. And so, I'm somewhere in between there where I'm not quite at that level, but I'm also saying like, okay, get above the memes. Let's try to discuss what's going on here without just saying, oh, so you're saying that you want to be like the Jews because you don't want to just have like a Nazi party and white nationalism where we unite all white people and blah, blah, blah. So it's like, okay, can we come up with words and terms that, describe reality and that also have an effect of forming a kind of a clique? And you say, oh, those are the guys who use that kind of language. And if I use that language, I'll be kind of like one of those guys. So I think all of that is important. And again, I would agree, come on the stream, people who are commenting. You don't have to use your face. You can just use an avatar. You can find software to change your voice online. I don't know. But just the act of speaking through it, people can hear the conviction you have in your ideas. It's very easy to get online and type a nasty comment about Catholics and Protestants or whatever. It's another thing to actually get on and say like, oh yeah, this is stupid, it'll never work or something like that. No, come on, defend your ideas. We invite you to do it.
So from now on, this is going to be a stream devoted to berating our audience. I hope that you like this new framework. So bifurcated comments again. Do you feel we should remain a minority? Is that going to benefit us in the long run? No, that's not what's being said. That's like people with this frame of mind are a minority, and we don't want to remain one necessarily, but we do want to retain that strategy as an option, I think. And so my opinion on this is that cutting edge minority has always existed. So alternative hypothesis published some research that I forget the actual guys who did it on the population replacement in the North Sea area in the last however many 100 years, 500 years approximately, maybe a little bit longer. And that cutting edge is a minority group with its own minority interests. Those aristocratic families did have their own networks and hierarchies and initiatic structures that they were members of, and they did have an interest that was somewhat different from the mass. And all people with a given ethnic background is not sufficient to organize society. Successful societies always have some sort of aristocratic elite with interests that are somewhat different from the majority, but not entirely. So, I mean, the real question, if you're a plebeian kind of person, the question is, do I want to be ruled by a native oligarchy or a foreign oligarchy? That's the question. So, if you want to, form an oligarchy, you have to take a minoritarian strategy. Obviously, you want to gradually recruit by throwing out a broad net, sifting what comes in, expanding somewhat. But even as the organization expands, you also want to create new inner sanctums, essentially. If the population base of the movement expands, you don't want the center to expand proportionally, because we have to deal with there's a limit to how effectively people can communicate. So I think you always do need a tight knit 100 or so people. Think about the Bilderberg group. Even though there are thousands of people engaged in these globalist politics that they're engaged in, they select people, 300 or so, to meet at various conferences, Aspen Institute. Yeah, they do adopt, even though they represent a vast majority of the population of the Earth. Most people are in some way or another playing into their system. Nevertheless, they themselves adopt a minoritarian strategy. So don't get us wrong and think that we're saying we should just accept being, as whites, this kind of fringe minority, like the Amish in our little enclaves. That's not the idea, basically. Okay, so Bifurcated actually does want to come on the stream. And we've been on for an hour and 47 minutes, so why don't... Unfortunately, YouTube is going to get rid of the messaging function shortly, so we're going to have to develop some alternative system. I have posted the Discord link in the past, so I would have to do that again. There's probably a way to set up a default description that remains constant, and I'll do that and have the Discord link in there. So join the Discord, and I'll leave a message in there ahead of time once we firmly schedule the stream. Ordinarily, we're doing Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then Saturday it kind of varies. I think in the next few weeks, the Tuesday time might actually not work out quite as usual. But anyway, I'll post the Discord link in the description. Join the Discord if you want to have a conversation. We can't really get it done tonight, though, because I don't want these to go more than 2 hours as a rule. But as I go ahead, I'll get the Discord link squared away. And Ken, can you sum up? We started with hereditarian democracy and then moved more into pragmatics of the dissident right and their organization. So do you think there's a connection there? How do you think we segued?
Yeah, it's all about the organization of people in society. And so when I open up with hereditarian democracy, it's okay, you have power, you're the dictator. Institute a system that works, not just for yourself in your life, but also for the long term, for future generations. And, we looked at different models for how to do that. Now, that's a theoretical, it's kind of, you could say it's LARPing or whatever. You could say it's just strategizing in the abstract. But then that kind of strategic thinking of how do you organize people, how do you organize systems, how does that work? It is important that the ability to do that and to think about that coherently is important, because there is a really extant problem of we've got all these people talking about various things, and we go back to the white nationalists because they are talking openly about stuff that most people are just head in the clouds about. They just don't know what's going on. So you refer to that as a kind of a Schelling point, or somewhere that we can all kind of see that is a force in society that both the left and the right are either extremely repulsed to or extremely attracted to. We've got this swirling social cauldron going on, and the left has really been able to organize. The last few hundred years is a history of the successes and the failures of leftists to organize and how that has impacted society. The right, on the other hand, when they organize, it looks like Buckleyite conservatism. It looks like people who are struggling to be like, okay, we're going to adapt, we're going to change, but like, please slow down these social processes so we can slow. I mean, Buckley was saying racist things. He was saying things like, blacks are not at the level of whites, but someday they will be. Like, he would say things like that, and that was kind of the conservative attitude. And so, like, there is organization on the right, but it is very short-sighted. It is very much, how do we win this political election? How do we get Donald Trump elected? The right can still organize. It has that capability, but it's the question of time scale. And so the right is so good at the short-term stuff. How do we bring it out to the long term? Because the long term is what we're thinking about and what's important. I mean, anyone who the important thing about white nationalism is that you've stepped outside of your individual life and you've decided, hey, I care about future generations. So you've already distinguished yourself from the vast majority of people when you get into that territory. The question is, okay, what is really best for future generations? How do we set up something? And that's when we talk about a minoritarian strategy. That's when we talk about university systems, exchanges of ideas, hierarchies. How do you form these things when you do not hold political power or military power? How do you do that? We know how it's been done historically with the majoritarian strategy. How do we translate that to the minoritarian strategy? And that translation process is very uncomfortable for people because we have a historical memory of how things should be. We want an ethno-state. But in a scenario where that is impossible politically, how do we then maneuver around that impossible barrier and actually make gains? It is possible, and people are going to constantly refer to, oh, you guys just want to be Jews. We should, and it's funny to say that, but we have to develop a language and a thinking about things where people can understand this is not about becoming, because if that's what was being advocated, then it's like we would have already done that. Like, if you are high IQ enough, you can convert to Judaism, and people have done that. I think one of the presidents of Harvard is a convert to Judaism. Luke Ford is a convert to Judaism, so you can do that. But like we've set up, different civilizations have different ideals. We still value Western ideals. We just know that the mechanism of an ethno-state has been denied to us. What mechanisms are left? What new mechanisms could we form to advance our ideals? And it is organization and collectivization and hierarchies within a totally different evolutionary context than we are used to. So it is hashing this out, getting people involved, not just at the critical deconstructive level of a commenter on the internet, but join into this, be part of this process. If you think we're headed in the wrong direction, then take charge, come in and exert your influence and voice. I'm going to tell you that the people who are watching are going to take your opinion with much more weight if you participate in the discussion on the Discord than if you are just typing away. So you do have power here, and you do have the potential for positive change if you engage with this. It has to start small, it has to start somewhere. But if you recognize the potential value here, and hopefully you do because you're watching, then you realize that it really only takes a small number of people to have a big impact.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to let you in the audience on a kind of housekeeping principle of my channel that I've used for a couple years now, which is I don't want the channel to get too big where it's unmanageable, where I don't have a direct um, relationship with people, and I don't want it to get so small where it becomes uninteresting and people with interesting new ideas aren't like adding input. So in the past, I said that I didn't want to be too large, and there are a variety of reasons for that. And it does tie into bifurcated duplicatus asks last question: how do you plan to deal with the current Illuminati from knocking you off as we rise in our goals? Well, that's kind of what I have been doing in not expanding too much. I don't think I could be a huge YouTuber because I don't have the patience to like do the aesthetic stuff, which I'll do more of that somewhat. I'll probably add an intro and stuff like that, but I do want to expand somewhat more than where we are now, just so we can have a little bit of a broader conversation with some more inputs. Now, I am interested in just testing out at the very end of this the Discord function and making sure that it all works fine. Um, if you want, then bifurcated. You said you would come on stream. If you want to join, just real quick, and we could have like a 5-minute conversation. How do you feel about that, Ken? Ken?
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself because I was coughing, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's fine. Do you need me to switch onto the Discord as well?
Yeah. So join the Discord and then mute yourself on Hangouts when you do.
Okay, just post the link for me if you could.
It should be in the description of the video, but yeah, I'll put it in the side chat.
Okay.
Okay. In the meantime, Stewie Griffin says miscegenation is unstoppable due to things like airplanes. The only reason we have races is that our ancestors had limited travel opportunities. And I think that that's just kind of not the way things actually did work out. That's not the way other species act. When you have a subspecies in a given area, they will defend their territory. And like the division between the Neolithic migrants into Europe and the Cro-Magnon indigenous Europeans, there was no geographic basis for the division, but was a very firm division in the early Neolithic between these groups, which means that races do defend their territory, and it's not something new. And like very, genetically different populations exist in relatively close proximity in tribal circumstances in like Central Africa or even in New Guinea. Like these people aren't that closely related in many cases to people who are relatively near neighbors, close neighbors. Yeah, so Bifurcated is not up for testing this, but Ken is in the Discord at least. That's a good thing. So yeah, we'll test out the Discord next time. If anyone's interested, go ahead and join. Also, if you're still watching this at this point after all the mess that this last 5 minutes has been, go ahead and click like, because I am trying to grow this a little bit so we can have some more interesting conversations. But don't promote it too much because I don't want this to get out of hand. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And hopefully thanks for engaging. And that Discord link is in there. Please join. I'll try to make it more active. But I work too. I work like 50 hours a week on average. Ken works. So we're busy. Everybody's busy. But this stuff is important. So that's my thoughts. Any last closing statement, Ken? Yeah, no, I can't hear you now because you're muted on the Hangouts.
Yeah, I muted on the Hangouts. Did you exit the Discord? I wanted
No,
to test if you could hear me on the Discord.
I was still in the Discord. I didn't see. Were you in the call-in? Were you in the voice channel?
I'm in.
You're just
Oh,
in the
I have to
Discord. Yeah, yeah.
click.
There you
See,
go.
this is how stupid I am. There we go. Now I have to mute myself here. Self echoing. Myself echoing. But let's stop this train wreck before it kills too many people. I'm going to mute
But anyway, good
myself on
conversation,
the
Ken. And we'll see you. You're able to do Tuesday, right? This Tuesday?
Yes, at 5 or 6, and we can hash that out in the coming days.
All right. Sounds good. All right. Take care. See you guys Tuesday.
Bye bye.